Hello there, and today we will be covering the top 10 GeoGuessr tips for Canada. Tip number 1. When it comes to separating Canada and the US, the very first clue you should learn is that Canada signs will involve the word maximum. They will not use speed limit. If you see maximum instead of the speed limit, you should be only in Canada. Whenever you get this diamond-shaped black and yellow checkered sign, you should only be in Canada. There might be some weird alternatives in the USA, but you generally also get arrows on these signs as well. So this is very common to come across in Canada, and also Canada like putting their signs on lampposts as well, which is less common for the US. The US love to put extra words on signs when they don't need to. So if you see yield on yield signs, you're probably not in Canada, because Canada, as you see on the right, will not have the text. So just be aware of that. Canada prefer not to add text, but like I said, US do the same at times with Canada, so it's not fully reliable. When you do get the text, it's a good way to rule Canada out. Tip number 2. When it comes to Canada, it's important to learn which provinces will have the rear and front plates. So if they have front plates, you should only be in BC, Manitoba, or Ontario. You will also get it a lot in New Brunswick, but I think it's no longer a requirement in New Brunswick, but this will become more of a trend with newer coverage, but you will still see front plates quite a lot in New Brunswick, especially in the Gen 3 coverage. Every other province should not have fronts, but some may have like trucks and working vehicles that will have fronts, including Newfoundland, so just be aware of that as well. This is a quick summary on world license plates of what the Canada provincial plates will look like. The only thing I would add is Ontario does not have that blue plate as often as you think. You do see one that looks more similar to Quebec's, but with more of a hint of blue on the text. If you want to narrow this down, Manitoba is the most distinctive Canadian provincial plate, and the best way to identify it is the hint on green on both sides. Northwest Territories also has a polar bear shape. That's a great way to confirm their plates, but generally you can use the environment to confirm you are in Northwest Territories. If you've got red text or like a massive red blur visible when you see the license plate, you should either be in Alberta or New Brunswick. And like I say, different ends of Canada, so you shouldn't really confuse it as often. In terms of blue text, you can get it in BC, Newfoundland and Labrador, and you also get it in Nova Scotia. But be aware, you can also get some hint of blue in Ontario, and Quebec can be baited. But a good way to separate BC from other ones is they will use stickers a lot more on the plates. Like Saskatchewan's plate has a hint of green. It's very hard to tell. But if you see that little hint of green in Saskatchewan, that is that plate. Just because you see a province plate and you know which province that plate is from, it does not necessarily mean you are in this province. So definitely have a double check before you jump the gun. Tip number 3. Right here, so when you get Canadian rounds, you will normally have the stop sign, but for New Brunswick and Quebec, you can also get arrête. Those are the only 2 provinces that should have it, but the difference is that if you have arrête on its own, it should be like 99% of the time be in Quebec. But if you've got a combination of arrête and stop on the sign, so a hint of bilingualism, which is very common for New Brunswick, you should only be in New Brunswick. There are very rare instances, I think I was told this by Fungus or another Canadian colleague. There are very rare instances, so don't take it as 100%, but pretty much 99% of the time, you should be able to identify the province from these 2 different signs. If you ever want to learn more rare Canadian stop signs, there are some US ones as well. Definitely check out GeoHint. It's a very good website. I'll link it down below. But yeah, you can even get more specific if you come across these very rare situations. Before jumping into these labeled diagrams, I want to drop a quick shout out to Plunkett, who have come up with an amazing guide on the website, which I'll link in the description. A lot of what I've learned from Canada has been from David Savage's guide, and I'll also link that down in the description. It's also had some updates that I have not seen yet, so I'm very interested to look at that myself in my own time, and I'm sure you guys will as well. Also, a big shout out to Jasper for also making some content on Canada for each province. I'll link his YouTube channel in the description, and you can check it out that way as well. Back to the video. Like the US, you get unique state signs. The same will happen with Canada. And I'm going to talk about the main examples on here to distinguish a province from another. The very common one that people come across is the Quebec green sign with the 3 star-like things on the top. That is unique to Quebec. You won't get it anywhere else. The only one that can be similar is if you look at Saskatchewan, you can also get some similar like pattern on the top. But the difference is that it is blue. So a good way to confirm you're in Sask is the shields are mostly blue. Manitoba and Alberta will generally have some text or just the word Manitoba or Alberta on their signs, so that is very useful. Ontario love using different shapes, so you've got like a parallelogram of some sort or 4-sided shape. You've also got like a king's crown, a queen's crown, and some random rectangle signs. You're probably in Ontario and they're quite plain and they're just most of the time black and white, but you can get variation in Ontario quite a lot. New Brunswick, you just have the outline of the province, so it's quite easy to confirm, and you can use the colouring to determine whether it's a major road or a less major road and so on. If you come across like a maroon or a brown like numbered sign, like we see in the top right, you should only be in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is the only province to have such a sign, but you can also get its provinces like flag on top of it on some other highways, so be aware of that. BC also looks very different to the rest with its shape and a little hint of blue, but not too much. Yukon is very plain and simple, and with the new Generation 4 coverage, you get a lot of like symbols for the different highways, so be aware of that. Northwest Territories will have like a polar bear on it, I believe. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's a polar bear, dude. And Newfoundland and Labrador, they will have something that says route on the top and then the number, and the colour of the outline of the sign will look different. And Prince Edward Island will look like it's got some white trees on that green strip top of its sign. I think that's pretty much everything for the state shields, or the province shields, I should say, for Canada. Let's move on to the next one. Yep, so for this instance, we talked about the speed limit sign saying maximum in Canada, and generally you just have the maximum and the number. But if you've got a black strip at the bottom and you occasionally see the kilometers an hour, like text on it, you should only be in Ontario. You shouldn't have that in any other province. There may be some weird leaks somewhere, but you should only go Ontario unless it's a super that I do not know. So definitely go Ontario when you see the black on the bottom. If you see secteur, you should go Quebec. I don't think it's present in New Brunswick. Feel free to correct me, any Canadians, if that is the case. But when you see secteur on the bottom, you should go Quebec. And if you see kilometers per hour, but without the black text underneath, this is where I don't want to mislead people. Most of the time, it should be BC. But from our research in Yukon and Northwest Territories and on random rounds in Alberta, I have seen it in those provinces as well, but in much rarer instances. So definitely still consider those, but they are just much rarer than coming across it in BC, for example. And they will have a mixture of signs in those other provinces. So don't think, oh, just because it doesn't say it doesn't mean it's theirs. Generally, Commissara should be mostly BC. Black strip should be mostly, or if not all, of Ontario. And then the sector should be Quebec. Kilometer markers can vary in their own way. So the main example we can get out of this that looks different to the rest is Ontario's. You will have that white square at the bottom, and you don't get any of that in any of the other provinces. The second one, or the two that also look very different to the rest, is the one in Quebec and New Brunswick. It has like another random bit attached that has no text on it, and it makes it appear wider than it should do. And I guess it's a waste of material, but it is found in Quebec and New Brunswick. Then it gets a bit more complicated. You probably need better looks, but the two factors to be better at identifying kilometer markers is the font, whether that font is bold, and also if you have that line below the kilometer. And as you can see, we've got one for BC, we've got one for Manitoba, we've got one for Quebec and New Brunswick, which we know have different shape anyway, but we also have it for, I think, Prince Edward Island and Nova Scotia. The other ones should not have that line, so it's a great way of separating them. And one thing I've noticed is Newfoundland and Labrador will have theirs much bigger, or the font will appear a lot more bolder than the rest. So definitely keep an eye out on that as well. But yeah, the best way to get familiar with this is seeing it on the street for yourself and practicing in your own time. Rightio, we're moving back onto signs that could narrow down a lot of the provinces. So this one, we've got green backed signs. And generally, community, when you see green backed signs in Canada, you should go BC, which is correct. You should only go BC when you see them, but people forget you do get green back signs in other provinces in Canada. So it's very important to look at the environment and other clues around you. Like generally the West vibe will feel very different to the East vibe, but you get very strange circumstances with Canada at times that can really mislead you. But if you don't think it's BC and you see green back signs, which this was not taken in BC, I don't think this was taken in Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia will have a lot of green back signs, especially like this, but you can also get green backed signs in, I believe, Prince Edward Island as well. So just keep an eye on that and don't fully trust the green back sign meta unless you are sure it's on the west. If it's on the east, then you're probably most likely going to be in Nova Scotia and maybe Prince Edward Island. But there will be other clues to help you for those provinces anyway. Also, if you come across these red and white arrow chevrons, you should only be in Quebec. You should not see these chevrons anywhere else in Canada at all. So that is a very useful clue to know. And finally, when I was mentioning about that black and yellow checkered sign with those arrows, this is what I meant. And if it's on like a board with like another yellow sign covering it as like the background with the black and yellow chevrons, you should only be in Newfoundland and Labrador. So if you see this, only go that province. Tip number 4. Checking the signposts in the prairies can be very useful to identify which province out of them you are in. And if you have the green and white stickers like a Nigeria flag, you should only be in Manitoba. When you come across ones that have white triangle stickers on them, you should only be in Saskatchewan. Be aware there might be some weird border leaks, but Alberta will not have the ones that I have shown previously and the one that we have in front of us. So that could be a good way to eliminating it if you have signposts, but you don't always have them present on every single signpost. It's just when you see it, you know it's going to be X or Y and not Z, pretty much. When you come across like these two metal like signposts attached to one sign in this kind of way, you should only be in Quebec. And finally, if you have a hanging sign like this, it is super common in BC and it's very rare elsewhere. So if you see this, definitely go BC. Tip number 5. Traffic lights can be very useful to identify which province you are in. And I'm going to look at one province in particular that can narrow it down to the city or the main cities it can be, and that is Alberta. If you have all black at the front of the traffic lights, you should only be in Edmonton if you are in a major city in Alberta. If they are fully yellow and you're in a major city in Alberta, you should only be in Calgary. And if you've got like mostly yellow, but you've got black in the middle, that means you're kind of in between. And the main one that's in between that you need to know is Red Deer. So if you see yellow with a hint of black at the front of the traffic light, go Red Deer as a safe guess. Tip number 6. It is important to get familiar with the different regions and the different vegetation you will get in different parts of Canada. Here is a simple map showing how the interior plains are split apart from the Canadian Shield and the Cordillera, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, but you've also got the Hudson Bay lowlands looking different to the Arctic lands. You've also got St. Lawrence lowlands, which is more towards the US border, will feel flatter, but will be green farmland and kind of grassy, whereas like interior plains will feel more dry and grassy and perhaps more cooler towards the north. Of course, you've also got the Appalachian region, which is where it kind of also borders the US a little bit. It will have more gradual hills compared to the far west, which have much bigger hills, and the vegetation is very different on the east coast than it is to the west. We're going to quickly move on to the more important slide now to explain this better. And pretty much it talks about the forest composition. So this is very important to separate the west coast from the east coast, but also the trees you'll get more towards the edges of the prairies and more in the more densely populated areas towards the US border in the east. So the very first group of trees that you won't really see on the east coast compared to the west coast is very tall cedars, or just super tall trees in general, but cedars or cedars or how you pronounce them, I'm very sorry if I'm pronouncing these wrong, I'm trying my best, but They are mostly common on the west coast. So BC, Alberta, Yukon, those are the main ones that should have those trees. And you can learn these trees by your own research. Like I said, I can't cover everything in this video, but we also get a lot of Douglas firs on the far west side as well. These are quite tall trees, and they are very different to the traditional firs that look like Christmas trees, so they are very different. And you'll see those mostly in BC and bits of Alberta, it looks like. Hemlocks, you also get quite commonly on the west coast, but I think you can get it a bit further east as well. But I can't really tell on this graph as much. I'm sure Canadian will have a better explanation. If you know your poplars for your birches and maples, then it'll be very good because they're kind of more central, more towards the north ends of the prairies. But as you can tell, it goes quite south in Manitoba, so that could be very useful to learn what poplar trees look like, and that could be a great way to narrow down where to hedge when you're in Canada, especially on those rural rounds. If we go further east, that's where we start getting more birches and more maples. So birches and maples seems to be more like an Ontario, Quebec kind of thing, and maybe leading into New Brunswick as well, and some other patches in Nova Scotia. But the more important one is looking at the firs, or in other words, the Christmas trees, which will go on quickly, but as you can tell, you tend to get that far more common on the east coast, and that will include Quebec, bits of New Brunswick, but also more importantly, bits of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. So let's quickly move on to that now. So here is an example of what the Christmas trees look like. And if you get large clusters of them, definitely think of Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm saying both because they both have a lot of these conifers. You get Newfoundland, the island, a lot more than Labrador. So definitely go there over Labrador unless you have a lot more things to use. If it's not generation 4, it can't be Labrador because all of that is generation 4. So generation 3, definitely go Newfoundland. Gen 4, check if it's winter coverage. If it's not, you're probably on Newfoundland. So definitely be careful of that. But with a lot of Christmas trees, Newfoundland is very common to have them, so definitely keep a note. And like I say, you can get them in other provinces nearby as well, but not as much as Newfoundland. Prince Edward Island is quite unusual, and you get a lot of like this pinkish soil, and this is a great way for a lot of pros to get Prince Edward Island straight away. But there is a big but. You can sometimes get this on the random parts of the northeast coast of New Brunswick, as I have experienced. I might muddle it up slightly, but I think it's that area you can get the pinkish soil occur. It's not necessarily a Prince Edward Island only, but you can use other clues to narrow that down. So for example, double yellows, obviously I think you get more common in Nova Scotia anyway than Prince Edward Island, but it is more common probably to find it in Prince Edward Island than it is in New Brunswick. And also you've got the white sticker to our right on the post. If you see white sticker on post, fairly common, you should only be in Prince Edward Island. They also have some weird unique pole tops that we've seen the difference that can be used and can be similar to some baits in other provinces, so be aware of that. But the main clue with Prince Edward Island's, environment in general is super flat most of the time, and you get a lot of this pinkish soil. Tip number 7. Right here, so we're going to quickly talk about the Arctic parts of Canada, and all of them can be distinguished quite easily, especially if you look around for a good 5-10 minutes for each one. But the biggest challenge is knowing where these places are. So Cambridge Bay is probably the most common one to get whenever I've played GeoGuessr, and it's been Arctic Canada, and it's the only one that has generation 2 camera in Canada in the Arctic, so that's a great way for confirming it. And like I say, the environment's very unique. You get a lot of puddles. It feels a lot more industrial than most other parts of the Arctic part of Canada, so be aware of that. But yeah, very useful thing to know is it has generation 2. The next one is Resolute, and this is pretty more north than Cambridge Bay, as you can see on the map. But the best way I can tell this apart from Cambridge Bay, obviously, is generation 3. But from other ones that are similar, it tends to be not as super hilly, which we'll get to soon. But also, there's not really much snow coverage, especially on the road. So that's a very good way of narrowing it down from other ones. And like I say, checking the location in your own time will definitely get you more familiarized. So I can only explain so much before you actually check it out in your own time. The next one is far more hilly than the previous. Like I said, the Grease Fjord is much more hillier than Resolute, and also you would tend to see the mountains much closer up to you as well, and occasionally you'll see a bit of the quad bike. As you can tell, you can kind of see it a little bit, and it is a red quad bike, so be aware of that. Be aware of Grease Fjord being very mountainous. A hint of red quad bike can't really be anywhere else in Canada or in general. I don't think you get anything looking like this in Greenland either, so it's definitely worth learning. Okay, so for this one, we're in Sankiluag. I apologize if I have pronounced that wrong, but it's the Don with the greyish hat using this vehicle that is very distinctive. And like the other ones, it is snowing on the ground. There is a lot of snow. That's a great way to separate it from Cambridge Bay, Resolute, and Grease Fjord. Even without the mountains terrain, it's super flat. It's quite urban, but not super urban. And it does vary. You don't always get this person unless like you're kind of in the village itself. You do get two different other coverage types of the person with a different coat on, or you just won't see the person at all, so definitely be aware of that. But yeah, if you see this, you know you're in Hudson Bay, pretty much. Okay, so now we're moving on to Iqaluit as well as Apex, and these are quite common to get if you end up getting it. Like I say, it's rare to get Arctic Canada rounds on most world maps, but if you want to get really good at it, Iqaluit is very important because it's probably the most urban settlement in the Arctic Canada part, and also it's got a lot of snowfall. So you got the snow coverage, and it feels far more, urban than we had previously. And Apex is very similar, but it will feel more sparse. The buildings won't be as close together, and also the signage won't be as developed, and there won't be too many signs going on that makes you feel like it's a decent sized area. So definitely think of that, and the quad bike is different as well. So that's something else to note down too. Okay, so now we kind of lean to the other side of Hudson Bay in Churchill. And Churchill is quite interesting because you can actually come across some polar bears in this part of Canada. Churchill's located in the far north of Manitoba next to Hudson Bay, and it's very interesting because you have the side antenna similar to like the Puerto Rico one. I don't think you see the vehicle that often. I don't think you see it at all in most instances, but you also have the Generation 3, and you also have like the grass peeking out of the snow, which is another clue if maybe you're playing NMPZ and you don't see the antenna. There are other clues to confirm that you're in Churchill. The final one I want to mention is not really in the Arctic, but I came across it during my Northwest Territories research of what the coverage looked like. But there's this place called Toledo, I think that's how you pronounce it, that has this very unique Google car. And it's also a very unique environment. But if you talk about the Google car, you'll have a side antenna again. But the difference between this one and Cambridge Bay is you've got a lot more taller vegetation around. And it also looks a lot more green with a lack of snow coverage, if any at all. So that's a good way to separate it from that. The other thing as well, I think Northwest Territories doesn't have Generation 3 besides Trekkers and this. That is very important to know because Northwest even normally has Gen 2 or Gen 4. So if you know you're in Northwest Territories and you see Gen 3, maybe you're playing NPZ, you don't even need to see the car to know where you are. And it's a beautiful environment. It's a very random remote place, and I'm glad Google have this street view. But yeah, it's a very niche thing, and obviously it will guarantee you a lot of points if you get this on a world map, for example. Another thing I would like to add is there's many other examples I have found for the Arctic kind of part in terms of, coverage and also differences in vehicles. Definitely have a look on time. There is definitely a lot. I didn't want to cover in all in this one video. Maybe in the future, if you guys want me to make a complete guide like I did for Greenland, feel free to let me know. I can do it for Arctic Canada. But besides that, I think the main ones have been covered and we can move on to the next tip. Tip number 8. Brassio, we're going to quickly look at the common bollards you get in Canada. The main one that's the most easiest to identify, probably not the commonest one, but it is the Manitoba one with the orange or the red kind of color with the gray and black. That is only found in Manitoba as far as I'm aware, so that is probably the most important one to learn in terms of how consistent it is. Also, Alberta bollards are probably the next important one to learn, which will have the traditional black, white, and black. The difference between that and the Northwest Territories one, which you can also get, but it's less common to get Northwest Territories, is the actual reflector is much bigger. So Northwest Territories, you won't see as much of the white, you'll see more of the black on the top. So it's a good way of separating it, and of course, you can see the yellow reflector instead of white. There might be some border overlap. I have seen it with BC bollards. The BC bollard, it feels like it's more inside the black rather than splitting the black up. And it can also be yellow reflectors, and they are most common in BC. But I've seen very strange scenarios with Alberta and BC overlaps, so just be aware of that. But 90% of the time, those 3 balls I just mentioned should be very effective. The other one I was thinking was Quebec, and these aren't necessarily bollards. You get them on the guardrails, and when you see a clear one color like red and green, you should be in Quebec, but be aware there are very similar ones, so I don't want to mislead anyone, but generally when you see those, you should be in Quebec. Here is a more detailed map of all the different like bollards or sign-like things you get on the side of the road, and it's very detailed, and I credit David Savage for having this on his guide. It's very useful, very effective, and will definitely get a lot of people better at Canada in the long run. Like I say, the main examples I've said previously, but like I said with the Quebec kind of like poles you get on the guardrails, you see that there's quite a bit of variation in other provinces, so be aware of those. And another thing you can point out is the diamond sign meta for Ontario, which we'll get into very quickly after this tip as well. Tip number 9. Okay, so in this image, we see a guardrail, but the more important thing is the green and white diamond sign. This is unique to Ontario. There are other clues to confirm Ontario, even the traffic lights are distinct to Ontario, but you can't really see them very well, but I feel that you can check that up in your own time. But the other two things is the cones. The cones will have more of a tiger color, so that more striking orange with black strips. Very, very common for Ontario. You can get similar paler ones in other provinces, but the darker ones like these, you should only get in Ontario 90% of the time. You also have like these kind of wooden, rails, like those wooden posts with the wires going across it. They act like guardrails, but when you see like white strips on them, that is a great way to confirm you're in Ontario as well. So quite a few Ontario clues in here. And yeah, hope that was useful. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so instead of guardrails, they use cemented walls in BC. There might be some super rare instance where they use normal guardrails, but 99% of the time when you see concrete walls like this, you should be in BC. But you can also get it occasionally in Alberta, so definitely be aware of that. It is very important to not just automatically jump the gun on BC, because you may get overlap in neighbouring provinces, as we've seen in previous tips. It's a pretty good hedge nevertheless. And finally, we've got these guardrails, and the most important thing here is that second wooden block that separates the main wooden block to the guardrail itself. These are most common in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and the best way to differentiate is seeing whether that second block goes underneath the guardrail, and if it does, you should be in Nova Scotia like 80-90% of the time. If it does not, you should more likely be in New Brunswick. It's not 100% effective, but it is reliable enough to use as a meta. Also, if you see the yellow dots on the second block, you should most likely be in Nova Scotia. There might be some similar weird ones you get in Newfoundland, so be aware of that. But like I say, that's also a very useful meta to narrow it down to just one province and have pretty good chance of getting it correct. And finally, tip number 10. I'm just going to call these things buckets. My brain's not working today, but when it's facing the road, it should normally be only BC and New Brunswick. And like I said, those are very different provinces and different sides of Canada. So that's a very effective meta, but it's another reason, but generally visually from a distance, you probably won't be able to see it very well. But generally when they're facing the road, it's one of those two. There are also 45-degree ones that look baity, like there are some in Alberta and Nova Scotia. So please be aware of that before you make a guess. It may seem like it's facing the road, but if it's not 90 degrees, then I would probably think twice before setting those two, or one of those two. These two clues confirm you're in Quebec. So the first one to our top left will have the sticker. The sticker, or the plate, sorry, will be mostly yellow with black on the top. And if you've got a close enough view, you will see the Q. But moving on to the pole top is a very strange pattern. It's like kind of more of like a bone shape. It's very weird. And that is unique to Quebec. There might be overlap in New Brunswick, but it's very, very common for Quebec. I'm sure a Canadian watcher will double check those two metas to make sure that I am correct enough when I'm explaining these, but it should be fine. I call this the big fat paperclip meta, and this pole top is unique, or should be unique, to mostly Ontario. So be aware of that. And the reason why I call it paperclips is because the arms or the cross beams or whatever they are normally meant to be are not long at all. They're more of like a shape of the ends of like two paper clips coming together. And that's how I remembered this meta. And I hope that was useful for you guys as well. Okay, so this is a combination of using two clues at once. So one clue on its own is not reliable enough to get it correct. The one that I would say is probably more likely is the pole tops. The pole top pattern should most likely be Nova Scotia. I think there might be cases where it's not. But if you also see double yellows with these poles, you should be in Nova Scotia full stop. Because Nova Scotia love using double yellows. It's kind of like the opposite of all the other neighbouring Canada provinces where it's by far the most dominant over the single yellow lines. So yeah, definitely use those two examples. And like I say, New Brunswick should very rarely, if not ever, have double yellow lines as well. So like I say, it can be a good way to separate similar provinces if you're hedging between like a Nova Scotia to a New Brunswick, for example. But like I say, you can see double yellows in BC, you can see it in Ontario, you can see it in Quebec. Not all the time, it's not as common, but you can get it. So don't use double yellows on its own to confirm you're in Nova Scotia. And finally, we're going to do another similar thing we've done before, but I think the individual methods are very useful on their own, but are not always 100% effective if you are only using it as your only clue. So Saskatchewan loves randomly putting these yellow small dashes between double yellow lines. Just because you don't see it does not necessarily mean you aren't in Sask, but when you do see it, there is a very high chance you are in Sask, especially if it is more of like the plains kind of like environment. And I've also shown the pole tops above my head, and it has a very long crossbeam in Sask in very common scenarios. So it's very common to get this in Sask, the long crossbeam with a 2x1, that kind of style with the insulators. You can get it in other provinces as well that are neighbouring it, like a Manitoba or an Alberta, but generally the crossbeam will be either shorter or you will get a generic Canadian pole top separating it, because with SAS you should not have like a disturbance in the pattern in between that often at all. But yeah, that is pretty much it for this episode. I hope you found this tip video useful. Feel free to let me know if you got any additional tips for Canada. There is so much out there, and I think I've included enough for a lot of people who just want to get better at Canada in a short period of time. The next episode will be St. Pierre and Miquelon. And yeah, thanks for watching everyone. I'll see you in the next one. Yeah, of course.